Hello, my name is George Falconer and this is Peniel. I recommend this little booklet. It's called A Passion for Life, but what it really is a copy of the Gospel of Luke. So if reading the whole Bible seems daunting to you, or reading the whole of the New Testament or the whole of the Old Testament seems a bit daunting, this will solve the problem because it's a short book, a small copy of the Gospel of Luke. Get this. Also, When Heaven is Silent by Ronald Dunn. This is a book about suffering and speaks a great deal of the sufferings of Jacob and of David and of Christ. And it helps us grapple with these scriptures in the Bible and try to make some attempt at making some sort of understanding about why God permits suffering. Get this book. I'm going to read from the book of Esther and chapter 5. The situation is that Mordecai has discovered that Haman has brought about the edict that all the Jews are to be put to death because the fact that Mordecai wouldn't bow before Haman. And Esther, his cousin, is in the royal household, but it has not been revealed that she is a Jew. And Mordecai has told her to appear before the king and make a request to save the Jews. She's warned him that no one can do that because anyone who appears before the king without being invited will be put to death unless the king holds out the scepter. She has agreed to do this after 3 days of fasting and prayer with her maids and also with Mordecai doing this in sackcloth, and the Jews as well. They're all praying about their survival. So, chapter 5. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. I'm assuming that the scepter was symbolic of command. Hence it was in his hand, just right there when they needed it to be. And I expect she was trembling when she stood outside that door, wondering would the scepter be held out to her, or would she be condemned to death? It was held out to her. Then the king asked, "What is Queen Esther? What is it your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." Half the kingdom. He meant that. It must have been tempting. "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now, what is your petition? It will be given to you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Again, he made the offer of half the kingdom. Would you be tempted? Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." So she's committed herself to the following day of putting the request before the king. She knows she's going to confront Haman. Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honoured him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. He must have thought that she was honouring him. How wrong he was. He's boasting that I and I alone get to accompany the king to the queen's banquet. I'm more important than anyone else, bar the king and the queen. And she's invited me along with the king tomorrow, but all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew, Mordecai, sitting at the king's gate. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have a gallows built 75 feet high, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to the dinner and be happy. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the gallows built. After 3 days of prayer and fasting, Esther finally fulfilled her promise of going to the king. I expect that she spent those 3 days begging God that the king would spare her life and that the Jews would be saved. And it wouldn't be just a quick 5 minutes, oh Lord, spare my life, la 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 la. It would be pouring out her heart, crying and shouting to God, or even in silence, but it would be a real emotional pouring out of prayer for God to do what had to be done in order that the people of God would be saved. And remember that Mordecai had pointed out to her that perhaps she had been appointed to the palace for such a time as this. Maybe you're in a position right now for such a time as this. Whatever it is, there's something you need to say or something you need to do, and you're in the right position to action this. Are you putting it off? Are you avoiding it because you think people will mock you, or that you'll lose position, or that somehow you will be disgraced? She was doing this with her life, not just the position. Anyone who appeared before the king uninvited could be put to death. And I would imagine that it wasn't just written down in law. I'll guess that perhaps some people had actually done it and paid the price. So she appeared before the king, trembling probably. And she had prepared for it with prayer. She had prepared for it with her crown. She had prepared for it with her clothes. She had done everything necessary to appear before the king, to please him. Remember how when she was a prospective new queen, the crown was put upon her head, and she had listened to the advice of the servant and taken with her the things that he thought was appropriate for her to appear before the king. By now she's got that experience, and I think that she had used that experience once again to prepare to appear before the king. She'll have remembered the training she got and used it. It must have been a tremendous relief to her when the king held out the scepter and she entered, and he asked her, "What is your request?" He knew that she hadn't just come for a quick chat. She had something to ask of him that only he could grant as the king. He had the power to grant anything, that he asked her what she wanted. And then he said this to her, to reassure her, whatever your request is, it will be given to you up to half the kingdom. That would have made her a mighty ruler if she had asked for half the kingdom. And he not only promised her that once, he promised her that twice. And perhaps she could have thought, well, I could profit from this. I could get half the kingdom, and then I could possibly use that to still save my people, and I will profit from it. That would have shown a black heart. And she didn't do that. She didn't think she could have it both ways. She knew there was only one thing she had to ask, and that is to spare her people. Even the king didn't know that she was a Jew. She made one request. She said, please come to a banquet that I will throw for you, and bring Haman. So the banquet was for just the three of them, and the banquet was special. And this book is full of banquets. Remember, it was at a banquet that Vashti refused to appear. And Vashti also had a banquet. And there was another banquet where Esther had to appear as the new queen. So here's yet another banquet. Banquets are important in this book. They are celebrations. And she was going to throw another celebration. And the king probably thought, oh, well, at the banquet she'll make her request. So Haman was brought to the banquet, and they feasted, and the king again made the promise, what's your request? I'll give up to half the kingdom to you. And she said, come tomorrow, bring Haman with you. I will throw another banquet, another feast, and then I will tell you what my request is. Haman went home happy, having enjoyed himself. And of course, the following day, he was going to be at a banquet again, and he thought to himself, I have been exalted by the king. I am so important. I am really the second man in the whole of the kingdom. And I am the only person the queen has invited to this banquet other than the king. That's how important I am. At the king's gate, he sees Haman. And Haman doesn't bow before him. And this makes him so angry. He'd been told about this. And remember that Mordecai had been petitioned by other people to bow before Haman, and he had refused. My opinion is that this was considered to be idolatry, and that's why Mordecai wouldn't do it. He honoured God first, the only true God. And here he is, and we're told in previous chapters, he tore his clothes and wore sackcloth. And he couldn't go any further than the king's gate wearing sackcloth. So he was obeying the law. And there he is in his sackcloth, presumably mourning because Esther had asked him to have 3 days of fasting and prayer with all the Jews, and she and her maids would also fast and pray. That must have got attention. Why is the queen not eating? That would have been the talk of the palace. Why is the queen fasting? Why are all these Jews wearing sackcloth? Because I presume they were. We certainly know that Mordecai was. And there he is in his sackcloth, still not grovelling to Haman. This, as I say, made him even more angry. Now bear in mind that the edict had already been passed that all the Jews would be put to death, so Mordecai was a condemned man already. So why make it even worse by talking about it with your friends and family and agreeing with them that you'll build a great big 75-foot gallows for him? Because he's going to die anyway, according to the law. But I think this was meant as a public spectacle to make an example of a man who had started all this, and the Jews would toe the line and everybody would see Haman and Mordecai, and they'd see Mordecai hanging from the gallows. In those days, that would have been a bit like television or social media. The whole of the kingdom would see this or hear about this and would dread the power of the king and dread the power of Haman. That was the purpose. So, a public spectacle. And he decided to accept the advice of his family and friends, and he had it built. And he's told by his wife, have it built, have this man executed, and then go to the banquet that where the queen has exalted you, and only the king will be there with you, and you are amongst the top people in the land. I expect that Haman's wife greatly benefited from this, because he boasted of how much the king had exalted him. It wasn't enough just as I'm going to the banquet. He spent time boasting about everything the king had done for him. He really thought very, very highly of himself. We shouldn't confine that to just Haman. We should look in the mirror and ask ourselves the question, how is my heart? Do I think far too highly of myself? Do I need to be humbled by God if I'm going to be of any use to God? Because if we think that we can't be terribly proud of ourselves, that in itself is being proud. We need to be humble before God and obedient to Him, and ask Him to expose our wickedness, expose our hearts to Him. But Haman didn't do any of that. He really thought he was something. And we might not think, oh, we are the second person in the land, but you know what? In our own estimation, we are the most important person in God's world. That's what most of us actually think, and that needs to be rectified. There's a Haman in every one of us. So here is the situation. He agrees to have the gallows built. And it seems to me these gallows were built very, very quickly. Gallows ready, execution tomorrow, banquet tomorrow, a glorious day. I'm going to be at the banquet where I once again I'm being honoured, and this Haman will be executed tomorrow. Job done. Yay. That's what he thought anyway. Amen.